Okay, everybody, welcome to another NOVA Scribes. Tonight, we are continuing on our series of author talks. Very excited to welcome back Mike Rohde, author of the Sketchnote Workbook and that other one, the Sketchnote Handbook, both of those. Welcome back, Mike. It's nice to have you. How's it going?
It's going really well. It's great to be here and hanging out with you guys.
Okay, so I gotta ask you the question that I imagine that you hear, or at least the statement that you hear all the time. So when somebody discovers like the Sketchnote Handbook, how many times have you heard, "Oh, well, I've been doing that my whole life. I just didn't know it had a name to it"?
It's about what percentage? 50-50 split, maybe?
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe it's more like 60-40. I don't know.
So how do you react when somebody says, "Well, I've been doing that. I just didn't know it had a name to it"?
I tell them I'm excited and I'm so glad that I was able to define it and give them license to lean into it.
That's really cool. So I love if we can just dive into it. And by the way, if you have your copies of the Sketchnote Handbook, I will be referring to pages and trying to get better at that one. So first of all, let me just say, if you see my copy here, this is wrong. It does not come with a spiral bound. What happened is that like I broke mine, and so I had to take it to like FedEx or whatever and get it spiral bound. And this is much better because now it lays flat, so I can refer to it while I'm actually working. But I love the first part of it, which is really kind of like, I don't, would it be wrong to call it a manifesto,
Yeah, I don't know. I guess so. It's sort of the story of how this all came to be. So I guess in that sense it is, yeah. It's defining sort of my approach to this stuff.
So what I'm really interested in is the pivot point that happened between here and here, right? Mm-hmm. Like to me, this is like, to reference something else from pop culture, this is like collect underpants. Step 2 is question mark and then profit, right? So like what happened in this step 2 here?
Well, it had been building up for a long period of time. I'd been doing notes probably 2 years the old way. And I think when I look back and thought about it, I was really getting into computers at the time and was also doing typed note taking. And so I think what happened was that because I was into this type note taking where you could almost keep up with someone speaking, that I sort of fell into this thinking that I could capture it that way. And then when I wanted to get back into note taking with books, my natural intention was, well, I need to undo, so therefore I'll use a pencil. And I need lots of space to capture all this because, well, it could be volumes of information. So then I went with a large, I think they were like green lined notebooks that I was using. And so that is how I ended up there. So that took a couple of years to kind of run that experiment to its end and realize like, this is not good. I don't enjoy this. I feel stressed all the time because I feel like I'm always missing something because it is kind of impossible to really capture every word that someone says, although I tried very hard. And it turned out that having the pencil to erase didn't matter because there was no way I was going to go back through that mess to try and figure out what was valuable. So the false idea I had was, well, if I capture everything, then I can go back later and then find all the juicy tidbits and make those connections after the fact. But the reality was I never went back and looked because it was just so much information. It just didn't make sense to go back in that way and see what was valuable. So like the whole premise sort of fell apart in that regard. And it just got to be too frustrating. And as I contemplated near the end of the year in 2006, I kept thinking like, there's got to be a better way to do this. What should I do? And I fell back on my process, which is as a designer, you're always faced with limitations. Many people in many business situations are faced with constraints and limitations. I think it's really important and valuable because it makes you be creative. And so I thought, well, what if I just place constraints on myself to see what happens? Let's run an experiment. I tend to believe in these little experiments to see how things work. And then if they work, I lean into them and do more of it until I kind of run it to its end. So I had this a pocket moleskin that I purchased at the bookstore. And it was sitting on a table because it was too beautiful to use. And I thought, well, what would be the most opposite of what I've been doing? And that would be that little pocket notebook. I could carry it. I love the idea of carrying it in my pocket and it being really small. And then the second thing I did is I realized, hey, look, I'm carrying this pencil so I can erase mistakes, but like, I'm not even looking at the information. Maybe I need to invert that one too. What if I go to a pen? And that might force me to be more aware. So when I went to an event in early 2007, I think it was March in Chicago at a design conference. I took these two tools. That was all I took. Went to Chicago and sat in this room for a day and started to make sense of the information I was hearing. And an odd thing happened because the book was so small. I knew I couldn't write everything, so I just gave up on that idea. But I knew it didn't work because obviously it was frustrating me. And then the second thing that happened was, because I was using a pen, there was this sense like I have to really think about what I'm putting on the page. So it slowed me down to start making decisions about what is worth putting on the page. I've learned the lesson that putting everything on the page doesn't work. What's the opposite of that? Well, that would be being very selective, filtering it through my own personal perspective. What will I use tomorrow when I go to work and do some design work? Like, what concepts could I apply? And started to look at it through that kind of a lens, and then captured information. What that did is I suddenly, it's sort of like when you do something and you stop it, you notice how much different it is when you switch. And so that was really clear for me that, wow, I have all this free time. I'm not writing all the time. I'm not sweating and worrying I'm missing something. What do I do with this free time? Well, I love lettering and typography, so let's do some lettering. And I kind of like drawing stuff, so let's just do some doodle drawings and sketches in there along with what I'm writing. And I wrote a lot less because, again, I didn't want to get to the place where I wrote too much. And so those three things all work together. And I just realized that, what I'm focusing on are the big ideas and the things that are meaningful to me, because the whole point I spent the money for this thing for was to improve myself, to up my skills, and to think differently about the design work I was doing. So that was really the pivot point in a little bit more detail. And so the big kicker was at the end of the conference, riding the train home, I was just reflecting back, looking at my, 7 pages of notes, 7 spreads or something, and just flipping through them and like rereading all the stuff, because I could actually look at all of the notes multiple times on the way home on the train to Milwaukee, while I was sitting there. And I also had this feeling like that was really fun. I can't wait till I get to do that again. Right. It was a totally different mindset from just the last time I had taken any kind of intentional notes. And then the funny thing was, as I started doing this more experimenting and doing it different ways, I started looking back past my professional career into my college career. And it turns out, when I opened up some notebooks years later, that I was actually doing sketchnoting. I didn't have a name for it then, but it was the notes that I took in class had drawings and writing and lettering, and they were all mixed together in the same way. So it's odd that I was actually doing it in the past and sort of lost the plot a little bit when technology got in the way, and sort of just followed this other path. And I had to come back to what I was actually doing before, even as a kid. All the drawing, I used to make my own comic books. I made my own newspapers, very much into this create your own stuff. And so it was, in some ways, it was kind of a full circle kind of moment when I realized that I just sort of come all the way around, and that came back to what was natural. And that's the story from me about that pivot point.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. And you actually talk about that in the book, about how kids draw constantly. And, this is something that I've heard, for example, Sonny Brown talk about a whole lot, that, everybody starts drawing, and then for some reason along the way, we give it up. Maybe it's the technology gets in the way, or, some teacher or parent says that doesn't look good, or, you don't see your friends do it. Maybe it's a peer pressure thing, who knows? But for some reason, like we start with this, and then we get it up. It's not like one of those things where everybody is born playing the piano, but it's, for some reason, everybody starts drawing, and then for some reason it's just, we let go of it. Yeah. So I want to talk about this, if this is okay, because this is where I think it's where the magic happens, right? That synthesis that you talked about, like that slowing down, focusing on what's most important. And by the way, I'm on page 11. Focusing on what's most important. I as a graphic recorder, I get people that run up to me all the time and say, "Oh, you're such an amazing illustrator." I'm like, well, that's not the hard part of the job. For me, the hard part of the job is listening to 1,000 words and picking out what are the 10 that I'm going to capture out of that, right? And where I've seen, you know, understanding that you're talking to some visual practitioners now, people who, you know, make their living off of their markers. Where I've seen other visual practitioners fall down on this is they draw what they know how to draw versus drawing what's important, right? Either what's important to them or what's important to the client. And sometimes those things don't get represented. So that hearing, that thinking, I think is really important. How do you do that? And it's such a black box process. It's like so in the back of the head. It's really hard to pull this one forward.
I've been thinking, it's odd that you mentioned that. I've been thinking it would be interesting to do a workshop on how I do that. And I'm not sure what I would do in the workshop because I'm not exactly sure what's going on a lot of times. It would almost be interesting to record myself doing the work and then try and go back and untangle it all and figure out what's happening. But as you noted on that page, I sort of feel like it's this whole body experience, right? It's the beauty of it is not just, you know, I think Brandy Egerbeck was talking this week she's got a course coming about drawing people, and her comment is you're not brains in a jar, like you are a full physical being, right? You've got a body too, right? So this idea that your whole body's part of the process was one aspect of it. But I think there's just something, it's hard at first. So people will ask, like, is it really hard to do this, the listening part at first? And I think it is, because you haven't trained yourself to think that way. But as you practice, you get better. And I don't know any other way to do it other than to practice and find and reflect and decide, did I capture that in the way that makes sense? And maybe it means you do it from video so you can go back and, like, without the pressure, try it and come back and review and sort of see. But I think it's just a matter of doing. It's really funny. After doing this for so long, even when I do typed notes now, they also kind of follow this pattern. Like, I'm an elder on the church board, the church that I attend, and I take notes in the meetings, and I find myself doing the same activity. I just don't happen to be drawing or doing lettering or, you know, whatever I'm typing, but my notes are very concise. I'm trying to get to the heart of, like, what is this message you're telling me? And you keep giving me little clues, and I'm sort of building up this picture, and then the picture becomes kind of clear enough that, okay, that's the concept, and I'll start to work on that. And as I'm hearing information coming in, I'm continuing to add to the image that I'm seeing, and maybe I'll even, like, something is different, I'll show a contrast next to it, right? It's this and it's not that, so I might draw the contrast. And maybe that person doesn't even say the contrast, but I see it, and then I'll put it on the page or on the screen next to the thing they're saying, right? So a lot of times it's like listening between the lines and trying to make sense of what's implied. Sometimes there's things that are implied that are not being stated. You have to sort of pick up on that. And I don't know any way to do that other than to do it and to know what it feels like. And I suppose there's got to be a way to train this. I'm really curious to see if you can, if there's some principles that would apply, that you could get to the point of, like, okay, you got to do these 3 things or these 5 things. And then, okay, now go off and do like 20 videos and come back to me, kind of a thing.
Yeah, I think it's really, really hard to train that. You know, I remember working with a graphic recorder one time. I was facilitating, and somebody had made the comment. We were talking about something that was very, very technical, right? And somebody had made the comment where it was like, well, you know, if we get this wrong, we're all going down with the ship, right? Which was probably the first piece of visual language that this group used. And the graphic recorder did an amazing job of drawing, you know, the Titanic with the back end cracking off, and, you know, people like jumping overboard, and, you know, there's Jack hanging onto the door and all that, like an amazing drawing, but didn't really capture any of the why, or what was behind that. None of the context that said, well, why was this important to the group that was there? So I think that level of, like, synthesis and discernment, and what's important, not just to you, and what can you draw? It's really, really difficult, I think, to put yourself in the shoes of your client and to hear what's important for them.
Well, and the level of difficulty goes up. So if it's an individual speaker who you can, you know, and they're in your native language, and you understand the context coming into it, and you have some sense of where they're going to go, like maybe you got the title, or maybe you're really lucky and you got their deck before they go on, even if it's old, and you come in a little bit prepared for them. That's one level. And the next level is, okay, now you have a panel on or you got a group, like you're facilitating of 10 people, right? Now the level of difficulty goes up again. And then if they're talking about some technical thing, which you're not an expert in, and you have to rely, like you could get really out of your depth pretty quickly. And I don't know what the solution is to that. If you have a group of 10 people talking about nuclear physics, like, and you don't know anything about that, that could be, maybe that was a job you should have not taken or thought differently about, or I don't know.
Yeah. Just because you mentioned pens, and just because I've listened to your podcast enough to know that you can do whole episodes on pens, right?
Probably.
What are your favorite sketchnoting pens? What are you drawing with these days?
Well, I can show you 3 or 4 that are right here handy. So one of my favorites is this guy. It's the permanent, I get the name here, the Neuland number 1. And I like the bullet, and I also like the brush, but I tend to have the bullet around. So I use that for really big bold stuff. But it's in the scale, because I tend to work small scale, like a lot of people here may work large scale. So for me, this is big. For you, this might be tiny, right?
I was going to say, you use that one with Sketchnotes, like that's your whole page, right?
Yeah, it would get super bold. This might actually be really good for filling in. So I might actually outline with something and use it as a filler.
Okay.
Probably the only disadvantage maybe would be to go with the chisel, because I could get sharper edges. But I kind of like bullet. I'm a Sharpie. I was a Sharpie guy, but this is like my new Sharpie, basically. The second Neuland pen that I can share with you is this one. It is the Neuland Fine One Sketch.
Oh yeah.
So I'm working small scale, so it's got a little 0.5 or 0.7, 0.5 tip. I sort of pick a color. I use teal as my contrast. I tend to work in minimal colors when I'm doing it on paper, just to keep. I can tend to noodle things to death if I don't watch out. So I have to again. I constrain myself. So I use black in a color, and I think it makes that color pop a lot more. So that one, I will use black in that. But lately I've been using the Papermate Flare. I kind of wish Neuland would like. I guess I could probably do this. I could like cut the end off and like fill it with Neuland ink. I don't know if the pigment would get jammed in this felt tip, but I think it would work. It'd be kind of cool to have, the permanent Neuland ink coming through a flare like this. So
Heather's got an idea.
Mike, have you tried the new 1SK ink?
No, I don't know. I think.
Yeah, so they have another pen called the Fine One Flex.
I love that one. Yeah.
So that's got a nice nib on it. And if you get the black one, the 1SK, after it dries, if you let it dry for a little bit longer than 5 minutes, it actually becomes more permanent, and it doesn't have that sticky feel that the outliner ink does.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, so you might call them up, tell them to send you a bottle.
I do love, for whatever reason, I think I carried the Flex with me and put it down somewhere, lost it. I really like that. I like that I could do variations of thickness, both thin and thick with the same pen. Like anytime I can collapse a pen into one pen is a win. But it's not for every project. Sometimes I do want that consistent line. I've been lately playing with the Pentel brush pen. That's a classic, right? And they just have these cartridges that you can buy, and I think I found like an off-brand on Amazon where they'll sell me a big bunch of these. This is a Pentel Japanese pen or brush, I guess you would say. So again, I like that thin and thick at times, sort of to break me out of being too rigid. I think it forces me to be a little bit more flexible. And then finally, lately I've been using I gotta figure out where my camera is here. This is a special edition, but it's just basically a Retro 51 roller, right? These I had years and years ago, and I thought that I was going to do public workshops more. I had these made, and we gave these out for the first couple workshops, but now we've given them all away except this one, and public workshops have changed a little bit. And then I just use the Retro 51's refills are really nice. They're nice, and I like a juicy ink, so they're nice and juicy and flowy and rolly. So that works really well. So that's sort of my current stable of stuff that I'm using.
Nice. Thanks for that. And by the way, if anybody's got any questions, just feel free to go off mute. I'll see it. I'll call on you. So Mike, this is sort of a business question for you. So graphic recording just by contrast, shows up very big and in the room, right? And what the nice thing about that is that if you do it for a new group, all of a sudden now here's 100 people who've never seen it before, and they're like, "Oh, that was cool. I want to hire you too," right? Which is kind of nice.
Yeah.
Sketchnotes, on the other hand, it sort of shows up kind of quietly after the fact. I don't know if I'm using the right language, but it doesn't have the same in the room presence that like graphic recording does. So where I'm going with this is that I could be wrong, but I think it harder, I think, to find jobs as a professional sketchnoter if you're not Mike Rohde,
I'm seeing more and more people doing sketch notes with an iPad. I guess the terms are starting to blur a little bit. I would say, some people will say a sketch note and maybe they mean graphic recording. I sort of think of it that you used to think of it as graphic recording was large scale and sketchnoting was small scale, but that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Probably the other dividing factor would be, I would feel like a recorder feels like they have to try their best to be neutral about the topic, where sketch notes are personal and it's okay. I kind of felt like it was okay to like interpret and put questions, and because it's for me, like I'm going to look at this information and ponder it, and it's going to help me get smarter. So putting in my own questions in there is okay because it's first for me and then for others. So there's two different kind of purposes, or I guess intentions, by the people doing it. But those aside, like if you're talking about functionality, I'm seeing a lot more digital work being done on iPads. It'd be interesting to ask Emily Mills next week. I noticed that she was really, really resistant to the iPad for many years. And I think you can ask her. It'd be interesting. I'll have to ask her next week if the pandemic had some part in that. Number one, you got plenty of free time to experiment. Number two, you're not going anywhere. So all these in-person events that you used to do are now not possible. And an iPad makes them possible virtually, where you can do this. And now that we're starting to come back in person, I'm starting to see things where iPads are plugged in and being projected. So in some way, you can sort of do graphic recording. It's just you're not the person standing in front of the board anymore. You're maybe sitting at a table with an HDMI cable plugged into your iPad Pro, in Procreate or whatever tool you like, and you're doing the work that you do, and people are watching it on this side screen, right, while the speaker's in front. So there's lots of merging and hybridization happening, I think. I think there's also this opportunity this opportunity to do it in online meetings. I know like my friends down at Sketch Effect opened up a whole new line of offering, which were these basically doing this visual note taking for Zoom meetings, right? So the organizer, the tech person could flip to it and show it in progress. I've done that before in person where I've been working on something, and occasionally the person in the back was running the thing. They would flip it up on screen for a few minutes and then shut it off and flip the slide. There's tons of ways to do it, but I'm maybe not the best person to talk to because I don't pursue sketchnoting gigs or graphic recording type gigs very much. I'm much more interested in teaching. I'm much more interested in illustration. So I've been pursuing those two spaces way more than sketchnoting, but they do pop up from time to time. So, and the ones that I've been doing lately are probably not 100% like done in the moment kind of a thing. It's more like I sit in the meeting, I do the sketch note, and maybe it's rough, and then I clean it up because I'm doing it on the iPad because it makes that possible. And then it's delivered after the fact a couple of days later. So there's two ways to think about that. One is, I think the disadvantage is if you're just doing it in the corner and nobody sees it until next week, you do lose that moment of awareness and then opportunity. However, there are some advantages to a delayed reaction, right? You went to the event and then a couple of days later, all the stuff that you learned is now compressed into these beautiful couple of pages that you can scan. You can print them out and put them in your cubicle or at your home office. And so there might be actually a benefit to it living on. Probably the other thing I might say that could be an advantage to a small scale, whether that's iPad or paper, probably iPad versus maybe a big board, is I've always had the sense like big graphic recording boards tend to work really good in person, and they're really tough to process in digital form. Like you can scan them, you could clean them up in Photoshop, you can make a PDF, but like the scale is kind of wrong. Like it's not really designed to print on a page unless you sort of like you almost have to plan, like, what is the end result before
Right.
you begin, right? So in that case, then the graphic recording, you'd have a lot bigger images, you'd have a lot fewer things on the screen, on the page, so that when you scan it and do that deliverable, it's in the right scale for printing and viewing on a screen, like a desktop or laptop screen, or even a phone screen, right? So
Right.
there are some challenges that you face with graphic recording simply because the scale works well in one state and is challenging in another state. So, I mean, that just basically comes down to talking to the client and saying, what do you guys want to get out of this? Like, what's most important? Is it more important to send everybody like a record of what we talked about, and that you think people are going to look at it and print it out and discuss it? It's going to go in the Slack channel or something like that. Or is it more important to see it in the moment and like, if it's facilitation with graphic recording, maybe the important thing is getting everybody aligned and seeing what they're saying suddenly appear on this board and seeing how it all fits together. Like that's the core of it. Like the after effect is a nice reference that maybe you'll look at, but maybe by the end of that meeting where they're all like getting jazzed because they're seeing all their thinking going on the board, that just turns into meetings and emails and phone calls and others. Like it just turns into project work, and that just becomes a means to the end of the purpose, which was to innovate or to get together and figure out how to solve this problem, right? So the problem is really the solution, not
Right.
necessarily the deliverable, right? So I always think, I guess I'm way too practical, and I tend to like, I used to be a print production designer as well as a designer. I had to produce all my own stuff back in the day. So like I could come up with cool, crazy stuff, but then I would think like, okay, how am I going to pull this off? Like sometimes I'd roll the dice, but I would tend to sort of work backwards to make sure that I could deliver what I promised. So that's sort of the way I think about those.
Yeah, actually, it's funny you mentioned it. So earlier, Heather and I were having a conversation around like, do you do something that you know how to do, so that you can show up and be your best self and be an expert, or you do something you have no idea how to do it just because it's fun, and it's exciting. And, I think Heather and I decided that we were both on opposite sides of that coin. Where like, I think she told me once is like she had to practice for 1,000 hours before she graphic recorded. I don't know if I've got the number right, Heather, but I was like, oh, I just learned this thing. Let me give it a shot. It's like where do you stand on that spectrum? I was going to ask you something. You were kind of touching on this. Let me get back to it. So I was going to kind of quiz you a little bit. So this here, actually, let me do this one. Just like you were describing. So that's an iPad. That's an HDMI cable, and that's, big projectors in this auditorium filled with like 350 people. So I'm asking you as the authoritative source, would you call this sketchnoting or graphic recording?
Oh, I don't know. You're obviously you're capturing. I mean, it's a super fine line, right? Like I would guess if you do I might call it sketchnoting just because that's what they're coming to me for. So I'm just returning to them in the language that they're approaching me in. But technically speaking, if you wanted to get technical, you were probably trying to be neutral in that case. You're probably not throwing your own opinions in there. So it would probably lean more to the graphic recording.
Interesting.
side.
Okay. And I heard you say that before, that for you, like the dividing line is that with sketchnoting, you are putting yourself into it. You are putting it through the lens of your own filter. It's more about you. And you see this a lot with like the travel logs, I think. So, all right, now this gets really interesting. So where then would you say bullet journaling falls into the spectrum? Because that's deeply personal, right? That's really your whatever's coming up for you. That's what you're putting into your journal, right?
Yeah. I know Ryder, he's a good friend of mine. And I think we both recognize that sketchnoting and bullet journaling do cross over quite a bit. I would say it's personal. Like, you're not going to put a camera on your bullet journal and like bullet journal for a group of people. So it's less performative, right? It is more personal, right? So again, we come back to what is the purpose of the thing I'm doing? Is it for me to learn? Like as an example, in a sketchnote, if I'm doing it just for myself, I might try crazy stuff. There might be inside jokes that only I understand, that when I look at it, I laugh. And when someone else is like, what are you talking about? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? Where I wouldn't put those things in, a product for other people.
Right.
Even the mindset that I take into that event would be, there are going to be people that look at this that maybe they didn't show up at this meeting. And this might be the only artifact that they see related to this topic. So I need to represent it well and make it clear and concise. And that's, it's adds more challenge, but I mean, when you deliver it, it's really fun to do too. So
Yeah. Since you know Ryder, can you please ask him to return my emails? I've been trying to get him on this for a long time. I think he thinks I'm some sort of crackpot, but I have sent him 2 emails. I met him on one occasion. I don't think he remembers. All right.
He's super busy. I'm hoping to work with him a little on something, and I'm sending him an email tomorrow. So I think he's just super overloaded.
I don't doubt it. Actually, speaking of which, so since you wrote the Sketchnote Handbook, Sketchnote Workbook, I mean, you've got and then you've got the, I don't have a copy of it, the book that you produced, the notebook, right?
Yeah.
You have that handy?
I do have one. I think this is a prototype edition. So it's got this rubberized cover that my friend and colleague on this, Mike Shiano, produced a notebook when we met, and he said, "Hey, would you like to do a notebook with me?" And I said, "Sure." So we started doing lots of experimentation with what we would do. We had an intention to do a Kickstarter, which we did and was successful. And basically the heart of it was the paper itself. So like the paper is really thick, bright paper. And I'd grown up doing this stuff with moleskins, which had sort of a, I guess you would say off-white or cream, or I don't even know what color that would be, which was okay. But I think when he sent me a book full of this bright white thick paper, and I started to test it, I was like, oh, this is really great. Like it could handle heavy inking. Some people have even fooled around with watercolor on this stuff, which I probably wouldn't advise, but we just thought it would be fun to make a notebook, a sketchbook that would be ideal for sketchnoters. And it's gone really well. We've sold quite a few, and we're kicking around maybe a version 2, just like Ryder Carroll's got of his bullet journal, maybe to do a pro version where it's maybe the branding is more subdued. So you can take it into a meeting. And so those are some thoughts, but yeah, that was a ton of work. Like Kickstarter campaigns are a ton of work. So if you want to get into one, be ready.
Well, also, I mean, to that point, you've been busy.
Yeah.
So since you've done the Sketchnote Handbook, the Sketchnote Workbook, and then the Idea Sketchbook, that one, how has your life changed? Fame, fortune?
Yeah, well, I think the book is probably the most impactful.
Mm-hmm.
It has definitely found me getting lots of projects because people want the person who teach this stuff, like they've seen this book or they've read the book. Oddly enough, lately it started out first inside organizations, but now the organizations typically are schools, although I am doing company training again, because what people are finding being hybrid is solving problems and visualizing things is a really valuable skill that they want to teach the people that work for their companies. So just finished a couple weeks ago with a company who they have these websites where they have customers who place information on there, and they need lots of guidance from their customer service people in solving problems which are technical. And so they had me do the basic sketchnoting introduction, just basically to let people believe that they can actually draw simple stuff. And it doesn't have to be art, and it doesn't have to be beautiful. It just needs to communicate ideas. And they had a lot of fun. That people were, I guess, raving about it afterward and wanting to use it in their work. So that's sort of where it's led to, is these opportunities to present. Probably the other thing that it's brought, and part of this is the book I had a chance to illustrate years ago called Rework, is book illustrations. So those are really fun. It's the same kind of visual problem solving, but it's a little bit different. So Rework definitely sparked that opportunity, and it continues to lead to projects for me. And then as I do those projects, then those projects lead to more projects, as you know. So
yeah.
And then the last component is just having the authority, I don't know if the right word, or the cred to offer workshops. I did a workshop 2 years ago on lettering, and this weekend I'm doing a workshop on the way I approach layout, page layout, and how I look at it, how I deconstruct layouts, which is a little bit of my graphic design background, and then how that gets interpreted. And again, it's like, I don't want to be like the college professor teaching about layout. I want to be the sketchnoter, and the way I think about it, it's probably a little bit guerrilla and a little bit experimental. and like the way that I look at it and all the tricks and tips and kind of that kind of thing. So you're really like getting my perspective on it. So I'm kind of bound into it. It's not going to be, like I said, it's not going to be like a college course with lectures for hours and hours. So
yeah. Well, I mean, to your point, let's dive into some of the details on one of that. So I was really excited to hear you say that you've got a class coming up on layout. And by the way, if you've got any of these workshops that are open to the public, feel free to share them, and we'll get them out there, as you say, in the show notes. We'll include that. So one of I'm on page 90 of the Sketchnote Handbook. One of the resources that's included in this that I found particularly useful as a graphic recorder and graphic facilitator was on what you call patterns, which I really read that as layout, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another term that I guess I probably should have called layouts, but too late now.
No, I think it works for what it does. Tell me about this a little bit. So you highlighted and yeah, tell me some, and then we'll talk.
Sure. So part of the project. Okay, so the underlying idea behind the idea book was to get people to visualize. That's the whole point of it. Or the sketch and handbook was to get people to visualize, because there was always some baggage. Oh, I'm not as good as someone else, or I haven't drawn since junior high, or whatever the excuse was. And so part of the reason we did the book and did it the way we did it was I didn't want all the art just to be my artwork, because I felt like the problem with that is you have a book full of my art. People will look at it. I can't draw as well as Mike, so I should just not do it. Like that is not I didn't want that to be an excuse. So part of that work was to pursue and secure samples from tons of people. And I've been doing this work and watching the community grow over the 5 years before we went to publication with this. So I knew a ton of people and I saw work. And as I collected work to write the book, to like make my points, I'd looked at a ton of sketch notes and I started observing, like, that's really interesting. It seems like there's just a few kind of layout patterns that I keep seeing over and over again that seem to repeat. I wonder if is that a pattern? And, if you look in the book, I don't claim that these are the only 7, like you can mix them and match them and there's others, but these seem to keep coming up because I was looking at so many sketch notes and said, well, let's just start like adding them up and like, let's see how many are there? What would there be? So as I looked through and observed at the time, it seemed like there were like 7 that seemed to be common. So those were the 7 that I settled on. And then if you look through the book, there's samples for each type. So I sourced, people that would represent those types of sketch notes. And it's helpful. Again, it's sort of like, if you look earlier in the book, I talk about the 5 elements of drawing. And that was basically this idea that if we break drawing down into this idea mapping thing, and we give people a memorable set of items that they can use, that they're more likely to use it. And I felt like I've seen I think there's a whole discussion a couple of years ago between, I think it was Dave Gray and Christina Woodkey, who were like arguing with each other whether these were language or not. I kind of stayed out of that one. But I'd seen these, I guess you call them visual alphabets. Some people had 12, some people had 14, there was all different numbers and different symbols in there. And I just kept boiling it down, like, okay, like how few of these can I get away with sharing that will get people moving? Number one, it's memorable, right? You got the Dunbar number, 5 plus or minus 2. So 5 fits that. And then it just kept things simple. So if you think of it that way, it makes it feel like, hey, this is approachable. I only have 5 things to remember. And if I put them together in interesting ways, I can produce stuff. So that was the intention there. And that sort of led to sort of this whole mindset. And that sort of led to, well, in the same way, if I can boil these down, what would be the 7 layouts that someone could look at and say, I want to do that one. And then I talk in the book, I sort of expand on each one and say, hey, this is really good for this kind of thing, probably not good for that kind of thing. So it is an example. One of them is skyscraper, and its focal area is for panels of people. So I had been attending South by Southwest, which is really panel driven, probably still is. So you might have 5 or 7 people up on a panel talking. well, how do you keep track of that if you're trying to take notes? Like, who said what? So the thought was, if you follow a skyscraper pattern, you draw like a picture or representation of each of the panelists with a vertical section of the page. And as they say stuff, you write it in their column, right? And by the time you get done, you find out who did all the talking and who did no talking, right? Because of what was said. But you can then track like who said what and sort of look at the information just from a different perspective. So again, these were all super practical, like when are they beneficial and useful? And that was sort of the thinking behind those, boiling it down to 7. There are definitely more than 7, but these were the 7 I kept seeing.
The ones you kept saying. Yeah, I love this. And one of the things that I've always enjoyed about your sketch notes in particular is that they're easy to follow. Again, just as somebody who like, I'm not just a client of the Hair Club for Men. I'm also, not just the owner, I'm also a client. So I also, I hire a lot of graphic recorders too, right? And this is a personal preference, but I like the ones that have structure to it so that I know how to like read them, Again, it's a personal preference. And I think that there's the popcorn is good if you want to explore it. And if your goal is to go back and kind of get a feel for how did this, if you wanted to read up on this thing, if you weren't in the room, it's a lot easier to do that if there's structure that's there.
Right. Yeah.
So,
the previous panel you saw there was Tim Reynolds. I don't know that he's doing much sketchnoting now, not publicly.
Yep.
The page before, like that was totally personal. Where it's like the first sample of popcorn was like just crazy. But like for him, it makes complete sense, right? Because it's sort of like when I talked about like inside jokes, like that whole thing is like a page full of inside jokes to himself, right? He can decode it because he was there and he built it, right? So it brings back memories for him, which don't translate for other people necessarily. And then it turns into actually more work to process because it's just so disorganized from our perspective, right? So interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight. Thank you. I appreciate that. This may be just me. I've always felt like that sketchnoting had a slight edge in terms of like its portability into social media, like especially platforms like Instagram. Like you had talked just a second ago about like, well, once you've got this big graphic recording that's 4 feet tall and 20 feet long, like what do you do with it, right? How do you take that and even reproduce it for somebody? And I've always felt like sketchnoting was a little bit better format to translate into the small screen. I don't know if I'm wrong on that one, but you take a look at just the number of hits that you get when you search the hashtag for sketchnotes versus graphic recording, and there's way more sketchnotes that are out there, right? Is that your feeling as well, that it's always been that it's more closely coupled to the social media side of things?
I think so. I mean, they sort of happened together. So I mean, when I got done that first time I did the experiment in Chicago, I posted my work on Flickr, which at the time was the hot social media, but it was social, it was a community. And the interesting byproduct there was after posting it, I got comments not only from people who attended and the speakers, but from people who had not attended, that they felt it was valuable. And that's when I realized, okay, I started out with this experiment trying to make my notes better for me, and that I achieved. But holy cow, this might actually be useful for other people. I need to keep experimenting with this. And the funny thing is I had no awareness at the time that graphic recording existed. Maybe I saw it at a conference and I don't remember.
Well, I know you saw it in 2012.
Yeah, right. Because I was in Pittsburgh and gave a talk there and met a bunch of people, including you.
Yep.
At that event. So like I felt like, wow, there's this like whole family of my whole family just suddenly, like I was adopted or something, and I found my birth family or something, right? So, and then learned like it had been going since a long time before any of this stuff. This all just seemed to make sense to me from my perspective. But I would say I agree with that. I think because it came up in the time of social and cameras and phones. And I think additionally, it had the benefit that when I started it, I was using these little pocket notebooks, which because of their scale, translate really well to photographs. Even the stuff on iPads is still pretty small scale. And it's like the proportion of the elements to the page size works a little bit better on the screens that you have, where the graphic recording can be, 8 feet wide by 4 by 8 sheet, maybe bigger. I don't know what the standard is, if maybe there is none. But if you want to see the whole thing, then the stuff's too small to really see, and then you got to zoom in and like pinch and zoom. And if you show different elements, then you don't see the whole thing, right? So you sort of have to choose one or the other. I know my friend Dario Paniagua talks about, he does something called PIGS, funny little name. I'm not sure what his acronym is, but basically he goes through and he finds the most interesting elements that he feels are on the map, that he calls them, and then he animates them. So he takes the concept and he does a little animation to sort of encapsulate that one idea into a social media friendly format. So it's like taking the work you've already done and sort of like, filtering it down to just one element that you can absorb, right? And then if you're really into it, then hey, then we'll send you, the PDF of the thing, and you can zoom to your heart's content if you want to go deeper.
Yeah. That's really cool. I've seen Tanya Gadsby experiment with some stuff that's similar to that, even up to and including things like augmented reality,
Yeah.
holding your phone up to a chart and all of a sudden these things pop out on your phone.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
So I want to talk a little bit about, I want you to talk about the Sketchnote Workbook. So you wrote the Sketchnote Handbook. It's awesome. And then you felt like you had to go and do another one, right? So,
Yeah.
let me just, one of the things that I really got out, I want to ask, why'd you do the workbook? And if I only had, let's see, how much is this? So if I only had $40 to spend and I could either buy one or the other, like, why would I want to do one or the other?
That's good. Those are great questions. So first of all, story. I felt like there was more to say. Like, we really narrowed and focused on what sketchnotes were and how to apply them in the most immediate way we could imagine, which at the time we felt like was meetings. So everything in there tends to be like meeting focused, like there's not other applications. But even as we were doing that book, and a couple of years after, as the book was getting popular, I kept on experimenting. So I was doing like travel sketch notes. I was doing food. I was going to football games. I just kept on screwing around. I was getting involved in agile teams and noticing like, hey, these people that seem really acclimated to visual stuff, like what can we do here? And so in the intervening period, just started collecting all these applications and felt like, wouldn't it be cool if we had a book that just talked about how to apply these ideas? And I felt like, okay, we could do that, but we still sort of have to give them the basics. We can't just assume they have the first book. So you'll notice in that book, the first chapter sort of covers the basics really briefly. I think we compacted in like a couple pages, and then we go into application. So I would say this, that if you're wanting to give this to someone who doesn't know anything about visual note taking, but you think they're open to it, the handbook would be great for them because it would get them started. If you're talking to a teacher who wants to apply it right away, so teachers are also really practical, right? Like when they find out that sketchnoting enlivens their kids and gets them activated, and then suddenly they can draw when they were told for years that they couldn't, and they remember more and they enjoy it, like they're on board. And for a teacher, having all these different ways to think about application is really valuable. So for a lot of times when I do work with teachers, I'll advise them to pick up the workbook because it's so practical and has so many different ways to think about applying the concept.
Yeah. I love them both. The chapter that I really got a lot out of was, and I'm so glad you brought it up, is the one on travel sketchnoting, right? Yeah. Because to me, this was the one that was like, hey, you can do this for yourself. You can do this as a journal, and I was like, oh, I never thought of it. Like, it's a simple thing, but like, rather than drawing professionally on behalf of other people, facilitating them through a process, I can make this personal. So this was like, oh, I can journal. And so, this is where it gets closer to that bullet journaling, that experience mapping type thing. By the way, and, I just have to point this out. You feature other really great sketchnoters and illustrators in here, including this person who talked about a 30-year Sherry. Cool. Yeah. Mine's signed.
Sweet. I need to get mine signed.
Yeah, we'll have to do that one. So, and then the other side of it, this is another one where I get to show off Heather's work, where she was looking at, I'm noticing that this is, what is this? The meadery of the Rockies. So the first one was Sherry. This one's about mead, I guess, Heather.
Yeah, that was my drinking phase.
That was your drinking phase. So this one's on Sketchnote documentation. So tell me about Sketchnote documentation. What is that? That
was this idea that passing information between people could be valuable. And I started experimenting with what could be things that I could capture. So naturally, recipes are a great application, right? Like if you want to make something, I can show you how that works. Documentation could also be, as an example, I attended locally here a class on espresso. So they taught me why espresso is the way it is and all this kind of stuff. And then we pulled shots and then we learned how to froth milk. And so I took my notebook and I wanted to document that process. So I understood. So when I went, if I ever had questions about coffee, I could just go back to those sketch notes and draw it out. Like, why is espresso so dark? What happens if it's too dark? Like he went into like nerdy detail, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Right. And then we had the practical thing where we actually pulled shots and saw like how to get crema and then frothing milk and saw all that stuff. I documented that process of doing it. So it was both an experience and information. So I kind of felt like there was an opportunity to be able to capture simple information to pass along, like cheat sheets and stuff like that, within organizations or even for yourself, right? Like you document something and store it away. You come back and like, what did I do again? Oh, that's right, I did that. And then you now have the secret.
Yeah, this is so cool. The thing that again, I never thought of this, but it was the rough and then the refined, which is, it's such an illustrator thing to do. You're going to do a rough sketch and then you're going to like fade out that layer and you're going to draw on top of it. And then you're going to fade it out and you're going to do it again. And you're going to rough and refine it. And, it was one of those things where it's like, oh yeah, I can go back and redraw something. It doesn't have to be the first pass, which is, that's kind of what it has to be, what you're stuck with as a graphic recorder, as a facilitator. You draw it, that's it. There's no going back, right? It's on paper, it's on ink, and
typos and all, right?
Yeah, that's it. Typos and all. Exactly. Well, Mike, we're just about coming up on time. Thank you so much. I want to open it up and see if anybody else has got some questions for you. Let's see. Andrea says, I only have the Sketchnote Handbook version on DVD. Are there significant differences between the printed book and the video version?
Oh, that's a good question. It's been a little while. The video for the workbook is pretty extensive. I think it's like an hour and 20 minutes. And we basically, in both cases, we didn't vary too much from the text of the book. We just tried to amplify it and make better use of the video format to communicate those ideas. Because I had this feeling like there are readers and then there are people who absorb better by watching. And I was also a huge fan of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So like my favorite shows were when he would go to the crayon factory and show them making crayons and ask questions. So I get to make like videos like Mr. Rogers. This is cool, right? So you'll see lots of on location. We tried to do on location shooting that would provide that additional information. So you have the handbook and the DVD. And I think I would say they're pretty close. Like probably I would say the video gives you the additional, watching me work. So like, as an example in the handbook, I think there's 20 videos. Video 9 was the one that everybody seemed to be most popular with people, because in video 9, my friend John gave a talk. So you've got a camera with John starting his talk, and then Brian, my videographer, had a handheld camera, and he came over my shoulder and then did a video of me sketchnoting. So you hear John talking and you see me actually processing and building the page, which was like, I think a 15-minute or 20-minute talk. So a lot of people said that they liked it because they saw like how little I was actually writing on the page. Like all this information was going by me and I was not capturing it. And then I would get something that caught my attention and I would put it on the page. So it kind of reset them or provided to them a perspective like, oh, so I don't have to write everything on the page, right? Which is this challenge, like, what do I write? Which is what we started with, right? It's a hard thing to define, but watching it sort of unfold where you hear the audio coming in and you see the person doing the work was really popular. So we heard that. And when we did the second video for the workbook, we made it a bit longer, and we, as much as possible, did those as much drawing live, recorded drawing of events, of experiences, of applications as we could, because we felt like that's where this video really is strong against a printed page, because you could see it unfolding in real time, and you could pause it and go back and like figure out what's going on in a way that is just not there in a book.
Seeing the process is what it's all about. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Now I got to go and get the DVD. So we're right up against time. I just want to check. Is there any other questions, comments for Mike before I stop the recording? Okay.
I was going to make a comment. You and Heather were having an argument. Well, I know you're having a discussion about experimentation versus knowing your stuff. And I think that those are both valid approaches, and they change based on the context. So let me put it this way.
Okay.
If I'm being hired by someone for a large sum of money or some of money to deliver an output for them that they will use in whatever way they use it, I'm going to go to the tools I know. I'm going to do the techniques that I know, because I want to deliver something and have reliability in what I am going to deliver. So I think that's super valid. And I think as professionals, that's sort of like an expectation, right? So that would be one side. On the other side, when I go to church on Sunday, I do sketch notes of the sermons, and I can do whatever the heck I want. I can experiment, I can try stuff out. And I think it's really important that you push yourself and experiment with things. And I think the context of like either, things I'm attending that they don't even know I'm doing it for, or the church where I'm doing it for free, so I can do whatever I want, right, is also valid to have this other side where you can do this experimentation. So maybe it's more of a question of where do you apply the different things? If you're getting paid for it, maybe you probably want to hold off on too much experimentation unless you've iterated on the experiment and you're like, okay, I think this is a cool thing. I think it's ready to bring into prime time. And then it becomes a new tool in your tool belt. And then you keep on working on the outer edge, doing experimentations, and some work and some don't. So that would be the way I would think about those two ends of the spectrum.
I love it. Thanks for that, Mike. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Before I do, everybody, let's give Mike Rohde a big NOVA Scribes thank you. Thank you. That was awesome.